Hello everyone. Welcome back to the show. Today we're very happy to have Mr. Arnold August with us. Mr. August is an author and a journalist living in Montreal. So welcome, Mr. August. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And once again, thanks for having me.
No, thank you so much for coming on. So let's jump straight into it over the question of Cuba right now, which is a very controversial topic at the moment. So interestingly, despite the disagreement,
right?
Yeah. Despite the disagreement that the two U.S. parties have over internal politics, in foreign politics, the Biden administration isn't that dissimilar than the Trump administration. For instance, former Secretary of State Pompeo put Cuba on the list of states sponsoring terrorism without a proper approval or review from the Congress. So why didn't Biden remove Cuba from the list when he became president?
That's a very good loaded question. Thank you very much. I'd like to start, if you don't mind, with the very first sentence in that question, so we could really take it apart, in which you mentioned the internal disagreements. I'm not sure that internal disagreements are really that important. It's a question of degree. I don't know if any of you saw the town hall with Joe Biden on CNN with Don Lemon a couple of days ago. What did he say about the crucial issue that impacted the United States and the world, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the literal, and the extreme violence by the police against Afro-American and others? What did he say? Well, he's not for defunding police. On the contrary, I want to increase funding for police. And of course, you get the usual platitudes. You want to take the bad apples out. Most of the police are okay and all that. So there's nothing really dissimilar there, to take just one example. On the issue of being more or less aggressive than Trump, this may surprise some people, but I said that during the elections, when everyone was really hanging on to Biden as the solution to Trump, when I said, watch out, it's very possible that Biden will be even more aggressive than Trump on international affairs. Why did I say that? How many times do we see him on TV saying, I'm not going to be soft like Trump is. I'm not going to be soft on dictators like President Xi of China or Putin or the Castros in Cuba or Maduro in Venezuela. I'm going to stand up to these dictators. So, taking from that, one can say, well, perhaps he's even going to be more aggressive. And that's the way things are going. When we get to Cuba later on, we will see how actually has increased the sanctions just yesterday against Cuba. So I just wanted to make this small caveat before going into the second part of that question, was about Pompeo putting Cuba on the list of so-called state sponsors of terrorism. Why did he do that? Pompeo did it specifically with regards to Venezuela. Now, in that resolution of the Secretary of State, Pompeo, just days before his mandate had ended, it says, the second statement says, they are against Cuba because it supports the Maduro government. Now, what is interesting is that they have this in common. When you ask, why did Biden not take Cuba off the state sponsors of the list of states sponsoring terrorism? It's very simple. Biden administration agrees with Trump that Cuba has to be pressured to release its moral and political support for Maduro. That is a very important point. I think that I don't know if you recall when the confirmation hearing in the Senate for Secretary of State Blinken, just a few days before Biden was inaugurated. In that, I watched through the whole 4 hours. It's it's really, a real eye opener. How behind the scenes, parties supposedly having different point of views, they actually, in that Senate hearing of 4 hours, they actually worked out a bipartisan foreign policy. Take the issue of the state list of states sponsoring terrorism, which you raised. During that 4 hours period, amongst the senators such as Marco Rubio, right-winger, Bob Menendez, another right-winger from the Democratic Party, they did not raise the issue with Blinken. I hope you're not going to take Cuba off the list of states sponsoring terrorism. That, at the same time, Blinken did not mention that list. In other words, they worked out a modus vivendi. They worked out some kind of a deal on the issue of Venezuela, on the issue of Cuba. They are going to follow the Trump administration with regard to these two countries.
Well, that was a very, very, very thorough answer, very detailed. So as a kind of a follow-up to this, you mentioned Menendez, you mentioned Rubio. They're both, one is a Democrat, one is a Republican.
Exactly.
So what do you think is what is driving the bipartisan consensus on Cuba?
Well, I think the question is very important. I think she gives a short background, if I may, on the issue of the elections, the last presidential elections. A lot of people saying, "Oh, this is a historical elections. We're finally going to beat that fascist Trump and have Biden being put into power." But in my view, it was historical, that elections, but not because what they are saying they defeated a fascist Trump. It is historical because, according to my reading of American history, which I've been doing a long time, this is the first time in American elections you have two Republican parties vying out for power. There was a whole important section of anti-Trump Republicans organized what is called the Lincoln Project, who grafted on to the Biden administration to oppose Trump. Now, once, of course, Biden got elected, he has a debt to pay to these anti-Trump Republicans. And so you have, for the first time, a real Republican Party, and I guess you would say the so-called Democratic Party was a light version of Republican Party. So taking this into account, everything else falls into place. For example, I think you mentioned Cuba. Now, a lot of people have been saying, well, Biden promised that he's going to change, he's going to reverse the Biden administration's sanctions against Cuba during the pandemic, and perhaps go back to the situation that existed before with Obama when Biden was vice president. But people, unfortunately, I really read these things in its original format. Now, when Biden says we are going to review the policy towards Cuba, he also says always taking into account our core values of democracy, human rights. Isn't that nice? So it's very convenient. Anytime they can declare, as they are doing now, that the so-called violation of human rights in Cuba, well, this whole policy of going back to Obama is no longer there. And I think that he also said, as I mentioned before, he said Biden is going to stand up to dictators like Castro. So we have to look at, that promise he did keep. Okay. Now we have to look at what they actually said during the elections, not sort of cherry picking what looks good for us under the false notion that there's really a choice between these two parties, that they're going to bring around major change.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Speaking of Cuba, Venezuela, and so-called state sponsor of terrorism, so the SST list, was formally established in 1979 as part of the Export Administration Act. The latter of which, according to you, citing the Washington Post, was, quote, a legal clause intended to give the executive branch the ability to restrict exports, arms transfers, and other commercial transactions. So, end quote. And you also emphasize that the act has the goal of strengthening the executive branch and not the Congress. So why is this fact important?
Well, it's important because obviously when it was put into place, the drafters of that legislation wanted to make sure that they could very quickly, overnight, declared that such and such a state is a so-called state sponsor of terrorism without going through the niceties of consulting the Congress and all that. So, this is basically why this clause was there. At the same time, there is the need, it's accepted by law, that if a government wants to say that such country is a state sponsor of terrorism, they have to notify the Congress. This is what Obama did during the negotiations to establish diplomatic relations with Cuba. They have to notify the Congress, and Congress has 45 days to say they agree or do not agree with that new designation. With regards to Cuba, the 45 days elapsed, and automatically Cuba was removed from the state sponsor of terrorism. But on that issue, let us just say, in any case, Trump did it without any consultation of anyone, stroke of a pen. So as I've written many times, and many people agree with me, well, if Trump could designate Cuba as a terrorist state by the stroke of a pen, what is stopping Biden from removing Cuba from that list by the stroke of a pen? But the truth is, as I mentioned before, it may be hard to take for some people, but the Biden administration is as bad or even worse than the Trump administration with regards to Cuba. I mean, just yesterday, remember, everyone's been asking Biden, please remove the sanctions. There were over 240 sanctions measures adopted by Trump during the 4-year mandate, most of which was in the conditions of epidemic in Cuba as in other parts of the world. 240 people say, well, you have to rescind those 240. Not only did Biden not rescind them, but yesterday, as a result of the so-called mass protests, we could deal with that later, that pretext, yesterday Biden increased the sanctions against Cuba, and I guess it's very far from removing those under Trump. He actually increased those sanctions against Cuba. So we're in a very complicated and difficult situation with regards to Cuba as well as with regards to Venezuela.
Right. So you mentioned the sanctions, right, and what people colloquially call the embargo. So about that, the Export Administration Amendments of 1977 stipulated that no longer shall a country face U.S. export control due to its communist status. Instead, the U.S. said that they shall take into account the factors that a country's present and potential relationship to the U.S. So whether it's a friendly or hostile nation towards the U.S., right? So what is the implication of this amendment towards U.S.-Cuba policy?
Well, I'm glad that you caught that point. It's really important because on the surface, it may seem to some, United States is becoming more liberal. We are not going to designate a country to be a state sponsor of terrorism if it espouses communism. But what, in fact, it does, it expands the possibilities for United States to put countries on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. If you look at the current list now, that is to include all kinds of countries, whether they're communist or not. If one looks at the current list at this time, if I recall, it's Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Iraq, Libya, South Yemen, and Sudan. Now, it's interesting to know, bro, in that list, there are only 2 countries that support communism, Cuba and North Korea. Others do not. So that's why they changed it to include more countries and not to restrict the use of the definition of state sponsor of terrorism.
Yeah, no.
Right, so...
No, Bruno, you go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so, actually, I mean, I think I was going to ask, I mean, what was the rationale behind this whole, I guess, scheme, but you basically answered it. So I guess we can move on to your book, Democracy in Cuba.
Yeah.
So in your book, you talk about U.S. centrism and the perception of democracy based on the U.S. model. So what we could call, I guess, from the age of enlightenment, like liberal democracy, right? Yeah. So could you define this concept for your listeners? And also, as a side point earlier, you used the word liberal. So for our audience, define what you mean by liberal.
Okay, let's deal with the question of U.S. centrism. We can go into, some of the features of it, the detail, but I think the most important thing for our listeners to think about, reflect upon, that the foundation of U.S. centrism comes from the very beginning with the establishment of the 13 colonies, in which they said, look, we are the beacon on the hill to shine light upon on the world. We are the chosen people. So, in my view, no one can really understand American foreign policy if one does that from the beginning to date. I mean, even worst situation of January 6, 2021, the assault on the Capitol and other activities, the U.S. administration, CNN, they still managed to say, we are still a beacon for the world, for democracy, etc. So one has to get this, racist, superior notion that only the United States are the ones that can define democracy or whatever. So that is the base. If you grasp that, then everything else falls into place. Now, the United States has what they call a multi-party system. Okay. First of all, their constitution, was never discussed or deliberated upon by the people. It was imposed on the people by a small clique of slave owners. And this is the same constitution that they have now several centuries later. Now, they have decided that the model for democracy is when you have two or more political parties. Well, I don't want to, if the United States wants to have two political parties, that's up to them. But I know in the United States, I work very closely. I have a lot of colleagues in the United States. And they have been, in fact, one of my books, I also mentioned that they have been fighting against this notion that the lesser of two evils. Every time there's election, people are saying, oh, they're the same. No. How about, we should vote for the lesser of two evils. Last time, of course, it was Biden. Now we see several months later how lesser of a two evil was Biden compared to Trump when it comes to Black Lives Matter movement, when it comes to foreign policy. So they impose this notion you have to have multi-party system. Of course, they're very flexible. To Saudi Arabia, which doesn't have elections, that doesn't have multi-party system, it's a monarchy. That's okay. We could let that go. We could have good relations with Saudi Arabia or even Israel, which is known internationally as an apartheid state. That's okay. We could have good relations with Israel, but not with Cuba. It's a pretext to use the fact that Cuba had a so-called one-party system. I would not say, we can go into that later, but it's not that it has a one-party system. Cuba had a revolution that developed over several centuries, and out of that came their own new concept of what it means to be democracy, which we could deal with later on if you like.
Yeah, actually, that was my next question. How would you define democracy in Cuba, like in general?
Okay, I would say that, just as I try to outline very short the U.S.-centric notion, Cuba, like my view, if to evaluate a country, we cannot compare, for example, Cuba to the United States. We have to deal with Cuba and its own historical context. Cuba in the 19th century waged a war against Spanish domination. And in the course of that war, they established one revolutionary party led by Jose Marti, who was the national hero of Cuba. They led that war successfully with one party that was able to mobilize around itself an overwhelming majority of people to free Cuba from Spanish control. This only came to a halt when in 1898, the United States, under the pretext of the USS Maine blowing up, came in to so-called help the Cuban people, but in fact, they replaced Spain and colonized Cuba once again. Now, Cuba basically had some kind of, different aspects of dictatorship from 1898 to the 1950s. An important historical event took place in 1953 when Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro, Che Guevara, and others, they organized the first attempt against the Batista regime in 1953. July 26, 1953. It failed, but at the same time, they came back later on in 1957 and finally overthrew the Batista dictatorship to have what I would say for the first time in its history, the Cuban people had power in its own hands as a result of this struggle. They actually participated in the struggle in the countryside when it finally triumphed in 1959. So at that time, there was no elections. There was no such thing as one or two parties in 1959. But the political power was in the hands of the people. I would characterize Cuban democracy as real participatory democracy. In other words, they see it as their revolution, their democracy, their social system, which they have been striving to develop despite all the odds, such as the blockade, right since 1959. Cuba did not have elections until 1976, when a new electoral law was passed. And only then did you have elections take place. But it's an entirely different thing when we go into elections, I guess later on in the program, how that operates, because it's a bit complicated. But the thing to keep in mind, Cuba is Cuba. They had their experience from the 19th century, their own experience from 1953 to present, have to be taken into account based on their own experience and their own history, not with a false comparison to the historical evolution of the United States.
Actually, before we jump into the election question, so you said Cuban is a participatory democracy. So from what I heard, the Cuban constitution is largely a product of discussion between citizens. So there were around, I think, 6 million citizens who participated in the writing of the constitution, and there were around 16,000 suggested amendments. Additionally, the constitution was subjected to a referendum, which had a turnout of 98%, and 97.7% of the people participated accepted the constitution. So what is your take on the absence of mainstream media here in the U.S. or Canada or in other Western countries reporting on this?
Of course, they only report on what they want to report. We had these examples in the last few weeks, but I'm glad that you raised the issue of the Constitution. I followed very carefully. I was in Havana at the time when the discussions take place. And there's one feature I think listeners should take this into account. It's said, or Cuba's portrayed as a great place. There's no debate. People are afraid to speak. Based on my, many years experience in Cuba, living there, if there is a country in the world where there's a lot of discussion, debate, opposing points of view, I said, it's Cuba. And in the Constitution, it was quite an amazing example of consultation led by the party, but in which the input from the people was enormous. Allow me to give you one example that may surprise you. In the draft constitution that you're talking about, they made some changes. The objective of the Cuban Republic was no longer communism. They took that out. So there was a backlash against revolutionaries in Cuba saying, no, we want to keep it in there. We know that's far. That goal is very far. We're not there yet. But we don't want people to say Cuba has given up communism. So actually, when it went back to the drawing board in the National Assembly, that clause was reinstated that Cuba is still a country that seeks communism, and that it's based on Marxism-Leninism. I can give you many other examples from the past as well. But let me give you one more example of participatory democracy that took place just a few days ago in the context of the so-called social unrest. The July 11th took place. That's a very controversial thing. We could talk about it. But what happened on July 18th, 6 days later, a very important demonstration took place in Havana, organized by the government. 100,000 Cubans demonstrated in Havana on Saturday, July 18th, to show their support for the Cuban government. I was interviewed by Telesur and others. I said, this is an example of participatory democracy. And I jokingly said, thank you for the media reports that it was a government demonstration. As this, it's the Cuban people do not exist if it's not part of the government. But I said, thank you to this international media by saying that demonstration was a government demonstration. It proves my point that the government, along with hundreds of thousands of people, are together in this participatory democracy. And there are other examples kind of given in the past. There are many examples to show in terms of elections, in terms of consultation on reform, on bills, etc., how the Cubans participate directly in the legislation, new laws in Cuba.
Okay, speaking of participatory democracy and continuing on to that point, actually, so talking about election and it being a part of participatory democracy. So Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman, writing in Manufacturing Consent, said there are basic preconditions to a free election in a country. So things such as freedom of speech and assembly, freedom of the press, freedom to organize and maintain intermediate economic, social, and political groups, also freedom to form political parties, organize members, put forward candidates, and campaign without fear of extreme violence. And 5, the absence of state terror and the climate of fear among the public. So that was basically quoting from the book. And so the basic narrative right now in the mainstream media is none of these preconditions are met and that Cuban is a one-man dictatorship rule. So according to your research, how are those preconditions in Cuba?
Well, I'm glad that you raised Chomsky's writing on it, because currently I'm going through some reflection on the issue of Chomsky. I was very proud to have quoted Chomsky, one of my books, on how he explains how the mass media operate by allowing only those journalists who know what to say that pleases the elite. I quote that. Now, at the same time, I also have doubts about Noam Chomsky on various issues. I don't think anyone should be considered like a king, a philosopher king. For example, I have much less respect for Chomsky since the last 2 American elections, where there was a massive move by the revolutionary left, Afro-Americans, others, Jews, even, and Green Party, which is there is progressive, it's not here in the United States, in Canada. They were saying, no, we do not fall for the lesser of 2 evils. Let's vote for a third alternative to undo that historical trend. Now, in 2016, Chomsky, rather than supporting that movement, suggested to vote for Hillary Clinton. Just recently, once again, with regards to a Biden versus Trump, he also said people should vote for Biden. So in my view, he has a lot to his credit and to what he writes about and what he says. But I think his view on the elections in the United States, he does a lot of damage. And, of course, the way he describes what elections are, I mean, even though he says that he's against U.S.-centric notions of democracy and all that, he basically repeats the preconceived views with regards to democracy, freedom of the press, and all that.
So if you say that those preconditions that I just listed out and which come from Chomsky and Herman's book, so if those preconditions, according to you, are U.S.-centric, so what are the conditions like in Cuba for election?
Well, they have a political system, even though it is far from perfect, but it responds to its own reality. Firstly, in Cuba, everyone 16 years and older has the right to vote, right from the beginning. And that came from the 19th century experience in the liberated territories against Spain, where they actually carried out elections, reform of education, etc., in that period. Now, since then, the 1959, the Constitution, which the Cubans approved in 1976, you have, what is the role of the party? The party does not participate in elections. That's the overall misconception that is presented by the mass media. Do we want to go into this now? One or two examples of how elections democracy takes place in Cuba?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Are we into that? Okay. So I know one of your questions is like how people are elected to how the municipal assemblies are established, how people vote to have delegates in the municipal assemblies. Why? Because according to law, and this is unique, no other country has it, according to law, half of the deputies elected to the National Assembly have to come from the municipal assembly. And they have the right to vote for one of these three different candidates. And the party affiliation is not an issue there. And once these elections take place, then these people are elected to the municipal assembly. Now, to get to the National Assembly, when the National Assembly takes place, the election, there's mass organizations which will choose from amongst those elected in that direct grassroots elections, nomination and elections at the grassroots level, amongst those elected to the different municipal assemblies, as well as other mass organizations such as university students, colleges, farmers, workers, until they come up with another list for elections to the National Assembly. And then voting takes place, and on the ballot box, you have several candidates, and people have a right to vote for one, two, or three candidates. Now, in order to be elected to the National Assembly, the person has to have at least 50% of the vote. And once this is established, the new National Assembly is established. And this is followed, I think this you have in one of your questions, this is followed by the elections to the Council of State. How do the elections of the Council of State take place? The National Assembly meets, half of which are delegates from the Municipal Assembly grassroots, and the other half are personalities from across the country. Now, in a secret ballot vote, they would vote for the new Council of State. Okay, and then the Council of State meets, and they would vote for one person to be the president of the Council of State. Now, then the president of the Council of State becomes the president of the Council of State. But there's another election. This is new, also voting for the president of the Republic. In this case, Miguel Díaz-Canel. So you have your president of the sort of the government, Council of State, and you also have president of the Republic. And I think the most important thing is, aside from these structures, watching the events taking place in Cuba over the last few months, how Cubans have been struggling in the context of the pandemic, the crippling sanctions, and all other pressures against them. They watching Miguel Díaz-Canel in action. He has very close ties with the people. You can't really say he's separate. When the initial outbreak took place on July 11th in San Antonio de los Baños, just west of Havana, on July 11th, he actually went there. He went there and he talked to the people. And we saw that on TV. He said, look, I spoke to the people. There are people, even revolutionaries are confused. And we have to deal with some of the things that people are being raised. But at the same time, he was very clear, we cannot accept vandalism. We cannot accept delinquent behavior by some of them. And of course, some of these people who infiltrated into this, these actions actually called for more sanctions by the United States against Cuba, and also calling for the United States to actually invade Cuba, to liberate Cuba from the Castro. So I've been watching this for a long time. There's something difficult to quantify, but the close ties between the government and the people is something that we don't see, especially in a country such as Canada.
Right, and actually, we're gonna talk about the protests now. So, the protests that are happening currently in Cuba, it's a rare moment where there are Cubans who are protesting against the government, and it doesn't usually happen. So, President Biden said that the U.S. stands firmly with the people of Cuba, as they said, they assert their universal rights. However, there was also, I'm sure you saw the Miami mayor who called for airstrikes in Cuba, who said, if I was to quote clearly, said that we should leave that option on the table, right?
Right.
And there were also several outlets like the Gray Zone who said that the anti-government protests were CIA driven, as they usually say that they are. But all that, together, what is your reaction towards this conversation happening in the U.S.?
Well, the thing is, in the United States and also in Canada, it's pretty much the same as far as the mainstream media is concerned. The coverage of that, it completely inflates, exaggerates the so-called mass participation, while it completely ignores the American blockade of Cuba going on for 60 years, which creates havoc. I don't think we can call these mass demonstrations. They're very small in several cities. Okay, now let me give you one example. They try to portray it as something that is very popular. I participated in an article with Mint Press on this, and we have photographs of a mass demonstration in Havana in front of the Maximo Gomez Monument in Havana. And the mass media say this is an anti-government demonstration. But there's one problem, bro, and that is in that demonstration we clearly see flags of July 26th movement, which is Fidel Castro's movement. So obviously it was a pro-government demonstration, and they try to make it look like an anti-government demonstration. Allow me to give you one other example, perhaps even more obnoxious. In Fox News, they had an interview with Ted Cruz. Now, in the backdrop to that interview, they had scenes from Havana saying that this is an anti-government demonstration. Now, they blurred out the signs that people were holding, signs that read, "Streets belong to the people," and "Long live the socialist revolution." They blurred that out from the signs, and they presented as a anti-government demonstration. There are many other examples. They even show photographs of in Egypt, which has a similar, and Cairo, which has a similar seawall as in Havana, trying to say this is the millions of people who are demonstrating against the Cuban government. Now, of course, there are some people in these cities who honestly participated because of grievances. But the main thing is, and I agree fully with all of us who have been studying it in detail, this whole thing was worked out by agents who are paid by the United States, both in Spain, Miami, and elsewhere, using Twitter, bots, and very sharply, using very sharply, for example, the hashtag SOS Cuba, so that it, in such a way, with hundreds and hundreds of recently created Twitter accounts, bots, logarithms, would just repeat the same thing, to the extent that SOS Cuba became a trending topic on July 11th. And then, based on these false images that they show, the impression is given that the Cuban people, the majority of Cuban people, are revolting against the Cuban government. And thus, the United States has to come in, and Trudeau made similar statements as well, by the way. The United States has to come in and help the Cuban people to overthrow this communist dictatorship. So I think the bottom line is, yes, there are grievances, of course. I mean, 60 years of blockade, pandemic, more sanctions by Trump. Of course, there are problems. But Cuban people, normally, if they are dissatisfied, they don't demonstrate as such. There are other ways for them to take into account. They would ask these people who organize the demonstration, the SOS Cuba types who are linked to the United States, why did they not present themselves for elections in the municipal assembly? They have a right to do so, but they don't. They do not want to improve the political system. They want to destroy it. So my reading is, yes, there are people who have some definite grievances and did go out to march for the first time. Normally it is not done in Cuba. But the whole thing, the main narrative is driven by Twitter and those who are involved directly with Twitter. And, they're talking now, shamelessly, I saw this yesterday, or the day before on CNN Fox, that saying, there are prisoners, that people have disappeared. There's no evidence at all. Now, I did watch a footage in Cardenas, in the province of Matanzas, of people, these individuals, actually delinquent, throwing stones at building. They even burned down part of a hospital. Delinquency. Now, this is not freedom of expression. Any country in the world would not allow people to attack public property. So they are trying to present these people who have been arrested for this public damage, for these delinquent acts, as being poor prisoners of conscience.
Right. You mentioned grievances, like protesters, that some protests were genuinely because of grievances. However, it's a very common story in the U.S. and even all the way here in Canada, but especially if you go to South Florida, Miami, that kind of area, of dissidents, of Cubans who escaped communism. So that the Americans, it's a very common story that we all hear. And actually, I'm sure you since you've done your study in this field, you know about the Bay of Pigs invasion, and a lot of the Bay of Pigs, the CIA trained militias were Cuban exiles. They were people who escaped from Cuba after the Castros took over. So why do you think these people fled? Were they fleeing the communist government, or what exactly were they fleeing? And all the way to this day, there are Cuban dissidents that you will see march and SOS Cuba actually. Yeah,
well, Bro and Henry, Cuba had a revolution that succeeded in 1959. One of the first things Fidel and the others did, was to honor their program. And they started to nationalize huge hacienda, huge farms, and divided into smaller lots for the peasants who tilled them. Also nationalized many banks and financial institutions, petroleum. At the same time, when they nationalized some of these entities, such, for example, those belonging to Canadian, they gave compensation. But the Americans did not accept compensation. So those people who fled were the Batista, those who were favored and supported by Batista, very wealthy in the rural and urban areas. So they fled because they lost their millions of dollars and their ability to completely enrich themselves without any consideration for the vast majority of the people. So that's what they fled. When they say they fled communism, well, I guess it's partly true, but because this communism or Fidel's movement was the very movement that started to change the entire situation in Cuba, where people were able to have free health, free education, and infrastructure, and many other culture, sports, you name it, and so they fled because their privileged position was lost. And they have no right to try to interfere in Cuba to give themselves that territory back to themselves.
So do you believe that that's well documented, well reported, that the post-revolution purges and, firing squads and so on were a necessary evil after the revolution of Castro?
Yeah, in fact, this will be coming out in another book that I will be publishing very shortly. But when Fidel Castro, he came to Montreal in April 1959. Not many people know that. right after the revolution, invited by Quebec business people. And then on that day, in 1959, in April, CBC went out to the streets of Montreal. I saw that footage, asking people, what do you think about Fidel Castro? You know, at the time, there was a lot of discussion about firing squads and things like that. Well, most of the people, you know what they said? This was unrehearsed. They're not people on the streets. Well, look, Cubans had a hard time because of these people. And I think Fidel Castro is right. He has to clean up the situation. He's absolutely right. There was actually sympathy in the streets of Montreal for Cuba, putting these people to trial, and when necessary, were executed. So this is, as part of life, and I think it's only normal. You know, Batista killed over 20,000 people while he was in power. Even John F. Kennedy said, we killed 20,000 people. And so the Cubans had every right in 1959, 1960. And this was as a result of the demand of the people whose relatives were killed by Batista. So we want to catch these people, put them on trial, and if necessary, they should be executed. So it's part of the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's not unique to the Cuban Revolution. After every revolution, generally there's a lot of violence and executions. It's kind of par for the course. I don't think it's unique to the Cuban, but actually, back to to today, the protests that are happening right at this moment. So there were obviously people like the mayor who said that we have to airstrike Cuba because of they're protesting against communism. But there are many outlets, such as the Gray Zone or the Belly of the Beast, that reported that they just wanted the basics. Most protesters just wanted the basics. So how much blame does the government actually have in not providing the basics for these people?
Well, I think the basics is a pretty large term. Like this, despite the pandemic, despite the sanctions against Cuba and the pandemic together closed down its main industry, the tourist industry, and so that was a huge amount of loss for the income of the Cuban people. Now, in that situation, my view is, and the view of my colleagues who I speak with in Havana, that despite this, the Cuban government has been trying to do its best to maintain the living standards of the Cuban people. At the same time, one cannot deny the situation is terrible. People now have to wait long lines in order to get food at the grocery store. One of the reasons they have to wait so long is, like here, only 1 or 2 or 3 people are allowed in the stores in order to buy the food. At the same time, Miguel Diaz-Canel, the president, and others are saying we have to take this seriously and we have to improve the situation as much as we can. And they did make some changes. For example, allowing food was not allowed to be imported from Florida into Cuba. Now it is allowed to be imported. They are making some changes. But I would say what people are calling the basic necessities, it is not the fault of the Cuban government that the basic necessities are not being met. We can never take our finger off the Cuban blockade. For example, you probably know this, bro. You study the history. In 1960, when the blockade was established by Mallory, Sub-Secretary of State, he said, this is not me describing, he said, we have to impose sanctions in order to make the life of the people miserable, the economic situation and dissatisfaction to such an extent that the people will revolt against the Cuban government. So I don't think it is fair to evaluate the Cuban situation without taking into account their own stated position to force the Cubans into misery so they revolt against the Cuban government. But even under these conditions, on July 11, 2021, it was not a revolt against the Cuban government. There were isolated incidents all across Cuba. It's true. But a small minority in there who we know are paid by the United States, spends millions of dollars a year to pay these people in order to create incidents, even if it includes looting, in order to create an atmosphere of a chaos. And what Biden said, Cuba is a failed state. So we have to make a clear distinction between people who want things to improve, that grievance will be met, and those who are there in order to create an incident to provide the United States to interfere, if it's not militarily, in other ways as well.
Yeah, speaking of conditions and grievances, so I think why the Cuban protest right now has such a great attention is not only because of the mainstream media's focus on Cuba as a quote-unquote failed state, but also because this kind of protest is very, very rare in Cuba. I think the last time it was in 1994 due to an economic crisis. So do you think, do you see some parallels between this protest and the last one, and how the mainstream media are reacting, and what are the grievances?
I think it's an important point. Yes, it's true what you say. And read that the last one took place in 1994, but it was very small compared to what happened on July 11, 2021. I saw an interesting reporter from Telesur just by accident interviewed a bystander in Havana, a young person about your age. Asking him, what do you think about the situation? And his response was very interesting. Well, he of course recognized that a lot of them, there were vandals who are paid agents who there to create an incident as a pretext for the state. At the same time, he said, we have to ask also why some of the poorest sections of the Cuban society joined in this demonstration. And he said, this is an important time for reflection in the Cuban society and the Cuban political system in order to improve the situation. So that's how Cubans are talking. When I speak to my colleagues on the phone, they say pretty much the same thing. No one denies that there are problems. No one denies that Cuba has its own problems, its own way of doing things, which are not directly connected to the blockade. I mean, Miguel Diaz-Canel, right from the beginning, said we have to do our own self-criticism. We have to improve things. So I guess you could say those who were out in the street brought this out into the open. But at the same time, it would be wrong to think that this was a revolt against the Cuban government, as the mass media in Canada and the United States has pointed out. I mean, since the July 18th mass meeting in Havana of 100,000 people, Miguel Diaz-Canel, things have been very calm in Cuba. People are taking stock of the situation. And as the Cuban government said, we have to keep on fighting to reduce COVID-19, which is still hitting Cuba very much. We have to work out how to, despite the situation, have better distribution of food and other necessities of the people. But, the main thing is the blockade. 60 years blockade. That really takes a toll on the psychological, social, political, economic fabric of a society. That's a long time.
What you just heard was the part 1 of our interview with Mr. Arnold August. Part 2 will be coming very soon this Friday, so we hope you keep an eye out. Additionally, Mr. August's books are on sale with the code Cuba20 in Canada as well as August20 in the United States. You can go to the link in the description below at Fernwood Publishing to buy it if you are interested. Otherwise, see you on Friday.